A millionaire CEO accused a little girl of stealing, until he learned she was cleaning his office just to earn a meal. Edward Hanson had always stayed late at the office. His life revolved around deadlines, contracts, and the constant hum of success that never truly satisfied him. That evening, as the clock neared midnight, the silence of the elite corporate building was broken by an unexpected sound, a faint, rhythmic squeak echoing down the marble corridor. He frowned, certain the cleaners had finished hours ago. When he turned the corner, the sight that met his eyes didn't fit the world he ruled. A tiny girl, no more than 5 years old, was kneeling on the polished floor, her small hands red from scrubbing. She wore a red sweater that was too thin for the cold, a dirty blue apron that hung to her knees, and yellow gloves far too big for her fingers. Her blonde hair stuck to her cheeks, and her blue eyes were focused with the kind of seriousness only hunger could teach. She wrung out a filthy white rag into a bucket of gray water, then bent down again, whispering something to herself, maybe counting the tiles or softly singing to keep herself awake. Edward froze for a moment, trying to understand what he was seeing. A child in his office at night, unthinkable. His instincts as a CEO kicked in. There were security measures, protocols, cameras. Someone must have let her in, maybe to steal. He took a sharp step forward, and his voice came out colder than he intended. "What are you doing here?" The girl flinched, her small shoulders jerking as she pressed the rag against her chest. Her eyes widened in fear, like a cornered animal. I was cleaning, sir," she whispered. "Please don't be mad." Her voice trembled, but it wasn't the tone of a liar. She spoke too softly, too honestly. "Cleaning?" Edward repeated, incredulous. "Who told you to clean my office? This is private property." He noticed the bucket, the small worn shoes soaked through, and the dirt on her knees. She didn't look like a child from any employee's family. Her clothes were old, her cheeks pale from hunger. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said quickly, clutching the rag tighter. "I finished sweeping. I didn't want to steal anything. I just want to eat." The words hit him like a blow. He stood motionless, not knowing how to respond. In all his years of business, he had heard every excuse, every lie people told to get what they wanted. But this child wasn't trying to manipulate him. She looked up at him with wide blue eyes that were full of something he hadn't seen in a long time, pure, desperate honesty. She wasn't afraid of punishment, she was afraid of being sent away hungry. Edward swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the soft drip of dirty water from the rag onto the spotless floor. Finally, he asked, "Where are your parents?" The girl looked down again, twisting the fabric in her hands. "Mom's sick," she said simply. "She can't walk much. I clean here, and then they let me have soup in the cafeteria. Only if I do a good job." Edward stared at her, stunned by the calm way she said it, as if trading labor for food was normal. His mind flashed to his own childhood, private tutors, warm dinners, a mother who tucked him into bed every night. And here was a child who didn't even have a meal unless she earned it with a mop. He took a slow breath and lowered his voice. "Who lets you do this?" She hesitated, afraid she might get someone in trouble. "The lady downstairs," she murmured. "She said I could help sometimes. I clean the hallways, and they give me soup. It's good soup." Her eyes flickered up for a moment, and despite the fear, a small, shy smile appeared. Edward felt something stir inside him, something foreign. Compassion wasn't an emotion he allowed himself often. It made you weak. But now, looking at this child trembling in a too big apron, he couldn't ignore it. Still, part of him clung to reason. "This isn't safe," he said. "You shouldn't be here at night." The girl nodded, but she didn't move. I just wanted to finish this part, she said, wiping another tile. I didn't want to get in trouble. Her hands were shaking, but her focus never wavered. She worked with a kind of quiet dignity that unsettled him more than her words. Edward sighed and rubbed his forehead, realizing how absurd the situation was, a millionaire CEO arguing with a child holding a mop. He should have called someone, ended this, gone home. But instead, he found himself watching her, unable to turn away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The building around them was silent, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Then, softly, almost too quietly to hear, she said, "I'm sorry if I made your floor dirty again." The innocence of it broke something in him. He crouched down so he could meet her eyes. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if no one had asked in a long time. "Lily," she said finally. "My name is Lily." He nodded slowly, repeating it in his head. Lily. A small, fragile flower growing in a place made of glass and steel. He didn't know it yet, but that name would stay with him for the rest of his life. The next morning Edward arrived at the office earlier than usual. He told himself it was to check on an upcoming board presentation, but deep down he knew he came because of the girl. The image of her small trembling hands scrubbing the marble floor haunted him all night. He had gone home to his luxurious penthouse, surrounded by silence and cold order, and yet the only thing he could think about was the 5-year-old who worked for soup. When he entered the building, everything looked as it always did, spotless glass, polished metal, employees rushing about. But there was something different in the air for him now. Every time he looked at the floor, he imagined her kneeling there, trying to make it shine. He asked the receptionist if she had seen a little girl, pretending it was a matter of building security. The woman frowned and said she had seen a child cleaning late last night with one of the janitors, and that the girl sometimes helped when her mother couldn't come. Edward nodded stiffly, thanked her, and walked away. He found the head janitor, an older woman named Maria, and asked directly about the child. She looked nervous, thinking she was in trouble. "Sir, she doesn't steal," Maria said quickly. "Her name is Lily. Her mother used to work here before she got sick. The girl comes sometimes. I know it's not allowed, but she's so polite, and the staff gives her leftovers from the kitchen. She never complains." Edward listened silently, trying to process the information. The thought that one of his buildings, his symbol of success and power, had become a place where a starving child cleaned for food made him feel a strange mix of guilt and anger. "She shouldn't be here at night," he said quietly. "It's dangerous." Maria nodded, lowering her eyes. "I know, sir. But when you see a child like that, it's hard to send her away." Later that day, Edward attended a meeting with his executives, but he couldn't focus. Words like profits, contracts, and expansion blurred together. For the first time, he questioned what any of it really meant. His company built towers of glass, yet somewhere within those towers, a little girl scrubbed the floors to survive. When the meeting ended, he didn't go back to his office. Instead, he found himself walking toward the cafeteria. It was lunchtime, and the hum of conversations filled the air. In the farthest corner, at a small table near the window, sat Lily. Her hair was still messy, her sweater still worn, but her face looked softer, calmer. She was eating soup, small spoonfuls at a time, savoring each one as if it were gold. He hesitated before walking over. Part of him didn't know what to say, or whether she would even remember him. But when she looked up and saw him, she smiled, a small, genuine smile that felt out of place in his world. "Hi, sir," she said quietly. "I didn't make a mess today." The simplicity of the sentence hit him like a punch. "I'm sure you didn't," he replied, sitting down across from her without asking. She looked a little surprised that he sat with her, but she didn't seem afraid. Instead, she pushed her bowl slightly toward him. "Do you want some?" "It's good," she said with complete sincerity. Edward almost laughed at the absurdity of it, a millionaire being offered soup by a starving child, but his throat tightened instead. "No, thank you," he said softly. "You eat." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sunlight filter through the large glass windows. The world around them kept moving, employees too busy to notice the strange sight of their boss sharing a table with a cleaning girl. Finally, he asked, "How long have you been coming here?" Lily thought for a moment, counting on her fingers. "Since Christmas, I think," she said. "Mom says I'm good at helping. Sometimes I clean the desks or the stairs. The lady in the kitchen gives me bread if I don't spill the bucket." She smiled again, proud of herself. "Mom says working is good because it means you're strong." Edward's heart ached. A 5-year-old talking about work like it was an achievement. He leaned back, feeling the weight of something unfamiliar, shame. For years he had built his empire on efficiency, cutting unnecessary costs, expecting perfection from everyone around him. Yet here was this little girl, doing the hardest job in the world, surviving without bitterness. "What does your mom do now?" he asked. Lily's expression dimmed. "She's sick. She used to clean too. But now she can't get up much. Sometimes she coughs a lot. So I help her." Her voice didn't tremble, she wasn't asking for pity. She was just telling the truth, the way children do before they learn to hide pain. Edward wanted to ask more but couldn't bring himself to. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped chocolate he had gotten with his coffee that morning. He placed it on the table. "For you," he said simply. Lily's eyes widened. "For me?" He nodded. She unwrapped it slowly, as if afraid it might disappear, then took a tiny bite. The smile that spread across her face was pure light. "It's the best thing I ever ate," she said. Edward had eaten in the finest restaurants, dined with world leaders and celebrities, but nothing had ever felt so real as that moment, watching a hungry child taste joy from a piece of chocolate. As he stood to leave, she looked up at him. "Thank you, sir." He hesitated. "You can call me Edward," he said. She nodded, repeating softly, "Edward," as if testing the sound of it. He walked away, but her voice stayed with him long after. That night, sitting alone in his apartment overlooking the city, he thought about her again. The world below sparkled with lights, but it felt empty. Somewhere, in a small room he had never seen, a little girl was probably cleaning or taking care of her sick mother, just trying to survive another day. For the first time in years, Edward felt something stir deep inside him, a need not for control or success, but for connection. And without realizing it, his life began to change. A few days passed, and Edward couldn't stop thinking about Lily. Every time he tried to focus on his work, her small voice echoed in his head, the way she had said, "I didn't want to steal anything. I just want to eat." It replayed in his mind like a song that refused to fade. He had built skyscrapers, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and faced ruthless competitors without hesitation, yet that one sentence had shaken him more than any business loss ever could. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports, he found himself staring at the same page for nearly 10 minutes without reading a word. He sighed, closed the folder, and told his assistant to cancel his next meeting. The urge to see the little girl again was too strong to ignore, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe something deeper, something he hadn't felt since he was young enough to care about things that couldn't be measured in profit. He went down to the cafeteria again, pretending he was just checking on employee satisfaction, but he was really searching for her. It took only a few minutes before he spotted her sitting by the window again, this time cleaning the table with her small rag before she ate. Her sleeves were rolled up, and her tiny arms moved with focus and care. She looked up and smiled shyly when she saw him. "Hi, Edward," she said, her voice full of the kind of warmth that didn't belong in the sterile walls of an office building. "I finished my work early today. The lady said I did good." He walked over and sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table. "I'm sure you did. You always do." She grinned, proud and innocent, as if his words were the highest praise she could ever receive. He noticed that she didn't have her soup today, only a small piece of bread. "Aren't you eating lunch?" he asked. She shrugged. "They said they ran out today. But it's okay, I'm not that hungry." Her stomach growled quietly, betraying her lie. Without thinking, Edward stood and went to the counter, buying a full meal, soup, bread, a sandwich, and a juice box, and brought it back to her. When he set it in front of her, she looked at it like it was something magical. "Is this for me?" she whispered, her eyes wide. "All of it?" He nodded. "Yes. Eat as much as you want." She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the spoon with trembling hands. "Thank you, Edward," she said softly before taking a careful bite. As she ate, Edward found himself studying her more closely. There was something so fragile yet resilient about her, something that reminded him of his own daughter, except he didn't have one. He had never married, too consumed by work to let anyone close enough. But sitting here, watching Lily eat as if every spoonful mattered, he realized how little he had done with all his wealth. His empire was vast, yet it had given him nothing that felt real. She looked up suddenly and said, "My mom would say thank you too if she was here. She loves soup." He smiled sadly. "How is your mom?" Lily's smile faded, and she looked down. "She's still sick. She sleeps a lot now. Sometimes I try to cook for her, but the stove is hard to use. I burned my finger once." She showed him a tiny scar on her hand, and his chest tightened painfully. He leaned back, thinking. "Do you live far from here?" She nodded. "A little. I walk." "Alone?" "Yes. But I know the way. There's a big tree, and then a blue fence, and then our house." Her voice carried a strange sense of pride, as if describing a kingdom she had built for herself. "You shouldn't walk alone, especially at night," he said quietly. She looked at him with wide eyes. "It's okay. I'm brave." He almost laughed, but it came out as a sigh. She was braver than most adults he knew. When she finished eating, she folded the napkin neatly, wiped the table again, and looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for instructions. "You don't have to clean here, Lily," he said. "It's okay to just rest." She tilted her head. "But I like helping. If I don't help, they won't give me soup next time." The simplicity of that statement made him feel sick. He had never considered that for someone like her, even kindness had to be earned through work. He wanted to say something, to tell her she didn't have to earn food, that she deserved it simply because she was a child. But he didn't know how. Years of distance and control had made his words clumsy when it came to emotion. Instead, he stood and said, "Come with me." She hesitated but followed him as he led her to the small employee store in the building. The cashier stared in confusion when Edward, the famously cold CEO, started picking up items himself, juice boxes, cookies, fruit, and a warm blanket from the shelf near the counter. When they walked outside, he handed her the bag. "Take these home," he said. She looked at it like she didn't know what to do. "All this, for us?" "Yes. For you and your mother." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, not wanting to appear weak. "I'll pay you back someday," she said seriously. "I'll work hard." He smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, Lily." As they reached the front doors, she stopped and looked up at him. "Edward?" "Yes." "Are you lonely?" The question hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth, but no words came. She tilted her head, waiting patiently for an answer, as if she had asked something simple like the time. "I think maybe you're lonely," she said softly. "You look like Mom does when she stares at the window." He wanted to deny it, to say that he had no time for loneliness, but the truth was sitting right there in front of him, in the shape of a little girl who saw more than all the adults around him. He knelt down to meet her eyes. "Maybe I am," he said quietly. "But it's better now." She smiled, a small but real smile that seemed to warm the cold air between them. "Good," she whispered. "Then I'll bring you soup next time, so you're not lonely anymore." Before he could respond, she ran off down the street, the oversized bag swinging from her arm, her golden hair catching the afternoon sun. Edward stayed there for a long time, watching her disappear into the crowd, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of humanity returning to his heart. Days turned into weeks, and Edward found himself growing more restless than he had in years. The business world no longer felt like the center of his life. He still attended meetings, signed documents, and spoke with partners, but his focus kept drifting to a small girl with blonde hair and blue eyes who worked for soup. Every morning he would glance at the lobby, half expecting to see her cleaning the floors or carrying a bucket. When she didn't appear, he felt a strange ache in his chest, a mix of worry and guilt that he didn't fully understand. It was on one of those gray mornings that he finally decided he couldn't keep pretending she was just another face in the crowd. He needed to know more. He told his assistant to clear his schedule and left the office, something he hadn't done in the middle of the day for years. The address he got from the janitor led him to a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. It was a place Edward had probably passed 100 times without ever really seeing. The streets were uneven, lined with faded houses and broken fences, the kind of area that the wealthy only saw through tinted car windows. He parked near a blue fence that matched the one Lily had described, his heart tightening as he stepped out of his car. Children were playing in the mud nearby, their laughter echoing through the cold air, but Lily wasn't among them. He followed the faint sound of coughing from one of the houses, and when he reached the door, it was slightly open. He hesitated before knocking softly. A weak voice called out, "Come in." Inside, the room was small and dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of medicine and damp walls. He saw Lily sitting on the floor beside a worn-out bed, holding a bowl of water and a cloth. Her mother lay under thin blankets, her face pale and tired. Lily turned when she saw him, surprise flashing in her eyes before she smiled. "Edward. You came," she said, as if you were an old friend, not a powerful stranger who didn't belong in such a place. He nodded, unsure of what to say. "I wanted to see how you were," he said quietly, glancing at her mother. "How is she?" Lily's mother tried to sit up, wincing in pain. "Sir, you must be mistaken. We don't need anything," she began, but Edward raised a hand gently. "You must be her mother. I'm not here for business. I just wanted to help." She looked at him uncertainly, then at Lily, who nodded eagerly. "He gave me soup and food," Lily explained, her tone proud, as if she were showing off a medal. "He's my friend." Edward's throat tightened at the word. He had been called many things in his life: boss, investor, tycoon, but never friend. He noticed how thin the woman was, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a cup of water. "When was the last time you saw a doctor?" he asked. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Doctors cost money," sir. Money we don't have. I'll be fine. Her voice carried the tired acceptance of someone who had long stopped expecting miracles. Edward looked around the small room, cracked walls, a broken heater, no sign of proper food. He felt something burn in his chest, anger mixed with shame. For years he had told himself that poverty was a result of laziness or poor choices. But now he saw the truth in front of him, a woman who had simply been forgotten by a system too cold to care. He turned to Lily. "Do you go to school?" She shook her head. "I used to, but Mom got sick. I help her now." Her words were so matter-of-fact that they didn't sound like a complaint. Edward crouched down beside her, meeting her gaze. "Would you like to go back?" She hesitated, her little hands clutching the cloth she had been using. "I like learning," she said softly. "I used to be good at reading. But now, I read to Mom instead. It helps her sleep." Her innocence crushed him. She wasn't asking for toys or candy. She wanted knowledge, something so simple that he had taken for granted his entire life. He stood and walked toward the door. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said firmly. Lily looked up at him in confusion. "Why?" "Because you and your mother need help," he replied. "And I can help." Her mother tried to protest, but he shook his head. "Please, let me." His tone was gentle, but it carried authority, the kind that people rarely refused. The woman nodded weakly, tears glistening in her eyes. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "No one ever does." "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly before stepping outside. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He sat by his window, staring at the glittering skyline that he once thought represented everything he had worked for. Now it just looked hollow. Every bright light reminded him of the dark room where Lily's mother lay fighting to breathe. He had spent decades chasing numbers, but for the first time, he wanted to chase something real. The next morning, he returned to their home, not in a suit but in simple clothes. He brought groceries, medicine, and a small heater. Lily ran to him, her face lighting up. "You came back," she said, jumping into his arms. The warmth of her hug startled him. It had been years since anyone had touched him with that kind of genuine affection. He spent the day fixing the heater, cleaning the kitchen, and talking with Lily's mother. She told him about her life, how she had once worked as a cleaner in one of his buildings before getting injured, how she tried to keep going but couldn't. "Lily kept me alive," she said softly, glancing at her daughter with love and sorrow. "She's stronger than she knows." Edward looked at the little girl, who was now humming softly while folding blankets, and felt something shift inside him. He didn't just pity her, he admired her. She had faced hunger, fear, and loss, yet she still smiled. When he left that evening, Lily followed him to the door. "Edward," she said, her small hand clutching his coat. "Can I ask you something?" He looked down. "Of course." "Why do you help us?" she asked, her eyes full of curiosity, not suspicion. He hesitated, then said honestly, "Because I forgot what it means to be a person, Lily. You reminded me." She didn't understand completely, but she smiled anyway, nodding as if his answer made perfect sense. As he walked away, her voice followed him down the street. "Good night, Edward." It was the first good night he had heard in years, and it echoed in his heart long after the sun went down. The following weeks changed Edward in ways he didn't recognize. He still came to the office each morning, but now he looked at everything differently. The building no longer felt like a monument to his success but like a cage built from glass and silence. He found himself noticing the people who had always been invisible to him before, the janitors, the cafeteria workers, the security guards. They all had stories, lives, struggles. He had spent years walking past them without a single word. Now, when he passed them, he nodded, sometimes even stopped to ask how they were doing. His employees were confused at first, unsure if this was some kind of test, but soon they realized he was serious. It was as if the man they had once feared had been replaced by someone human. Yet beneath this quiet transformation, a deeper thought had begun to take root. He wanted to do more for Lily and her mother than temporary acts of kindness. He didn't want to simply fix what was broken, he wanted to change their lives completely. He visited them almost every evening, bringing food, medicine, and books for Lily. Sometimes he would sit at the small table while she read aloud, her voice filling the room with the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Her mother was recovering slowly, though her cough lingered. She often thanked him, but he would wave it off, saying, "You don't owe me anything." The truth was, he didn't help them out of charity anymore. He did it because he needed it. Their little home, despite its cracks and cold walls, had become a place where he could breathe. There was something about the smell of soup cooking, the sound of Lily's laughter, and the simple presence of people who expected nothing from him that healed something inside him. One evening, when he arrived with a bag of groceries, he found Lily sitting outside on the steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. She looked up and smiled faintly, but her eyes were red. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting the bag down beside her. She hesitated, wiping her cheeks quickly. "Mom's coughing again." She said, "It's fine, but I can tell it hurts. The medicine's almost gone." Edward sat down beside her, his heart tightening. "We'll get more tomorrow," he said. "Don't worry." She nodded but didn't look convinced. "Edward," she said quietly after a moment, "am I a bad girl for wanting to go to school again?" The question stunned him. "Of course not," he said firmly. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom says I shouldn't leave her alone. I want to help her, but, when I see other kids with backpacks, I feel something here." She pressed her small hand to her chest. "Like I'm missing something." Edward looked out at the fading light, feeling an ache in his own chest. "Lily," he said softly, "you're not missing anything that can't be found again. And you will go back to school. I promise." She turned to him, eyes wide with hope, as if afraid to believe him. "Really?" "Really," he said, meeting her gaze. "I'll make sure of it." She smiled then, the kind of smile that could melt ice, and leaned against his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. It was the first time she had touched him like that, and it felt natural, like a father and daughter sitting together after a long day. That night, when he returned home, Edward began making phone calls. He contacted a private clinic to arrange proper treatment for Lily's mother, then spoke with the principal of a local school about enrolling a student whose circumstances were special. The principal hesitated at first, but when Edward mentioned he would personally handle the tuition and expenses, the matter was settled instantly. The next morning, he returned to Lily's home with a quiet excitement he hadn't felt in years. Her mother was sitting up when he entered, looking stronger but still fragile. "You're early," she said with a faint smile. "I wanted to bring you something," he replied, handing her a folder. Inside were the clinic forms and a school admission letter for Lily. She looked at the papers in disbelief, her hand trembling. We can't accept this," she said weakly. "You've done enough already." Edward knelt beside her bed, his expression steady but kind. "You once cleaned my building without anyone noticing. You worked harder than anyone I know, and yet life forgot about you. This isn't charity. It's balance." Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he said. "Just get better." Lily came running from the other room, holding the letter he had shown her earlier. "Mom! I can go to school, she shouted, her voice full of light. Her mother smiled through her tears, pulling her close. Yes, sweetheart. You can. Edward watched them, a lump forming in his throat. For once, he didn't feel like a man saving someone. He felt like someone being saved. Over the next few days, he made sure everything was arranged. A car would pick Lily up for school each morning and bring her home in the afternoon. A nurse would visit her mother daily. He handled it all quietly, not telling anyone at the office what he was doing. He didn't want attention, he just wanted them safe. When Lily started her first day of school, she wore a new backpack that looked too big for her small frame. She hugged him tightly before climbing into the car. "I'll read you everything I learn," she said proudly. He smiled. "I'll hold you to that." As the car drove away, he stood there on the sidewalk longer than he meant to, watching until it disappeared. Something deep inside him shifted again, something that felt like peace. But as he turned back toward his car, he couldn't shake a strange feeling, like this was only the beginning. Life had a way of testing even the purest moments, and though he didn't know it yet, a storm was coming, one that would force him to confront not just the world's cruelty but his own past. For now, though, he allowed himself to smile, because for the first time in decades, he had done something that truly mattered. The first weeks of Lily's new school life brought Edward more joy than he could have imagined. Every morning he would stop by her small house, watching as she came running out the door with her backpack bouncing and her golden hair shining in the sunlight. Her laughter filled the quiet street like a melody that reminded him what happiness sounded like. Sometimes she would wave from the car window, holding up a drawing or a paper with a gold star sticker, shouting, "I'll show you later," before disappearing into the city. He would stand there long after the car was gone, a small smile lingering on his face as he realized that something inside him had awakened, something tender, protective, and real. For the first time since his parents' death decades ago, he felt like he belonged to someone, even if that someone was just a little girl who called him her friend. But life, as Edward had learned too many times before, never allowed happiness to exist without testing it. One afternoon, while reviewing some documents in his office, his phone rang. It was the nurse he had hired to take care of Lily's mother. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Hale, I think you should come here immediately. It's about Lily's mother." Edward's chest tightened. He didn't wait for another word. He left his office without explanation, ignoring the confused looks from his employees as he ran to the elevator. The drive to their neighborhood felt endless. Every red light was torture, every turn of the steering wheel felt heavier. By the time he arrived, the nurse was standing outside, her eyes filled with pity. "She's very weak," she said softly. "The infection spread faster than expected. I've done everything I can, but she needs to be moved to the hospital now." Edward rushed inside. Lily was sitting on the floor beside the bed, her small hands gripping her mother's arm as if holding her there by will alone. "Mommy, stay awake," she whispered, her voice shaking. When she saw Edward, she ran to him and buried her face in his chest. "She won't talk to me," she cried. He held her tightly, his heart breaking at the sound of her sobs. "We're going to help her," he said, more to himself than to her. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, and they carefully carried the frail woman onto a stretcher. Lily refused to let go of her mother's hand, walking beside her all the way to the ambulance. Edward climbed in too, taking Lily onto his lap as the siren began to wail. At the hospital, the doctors moved quickly, and Edward did everything he could, calling specialists, arranging private rooms, signing whatever papers they handed him. But the doctor's expression told him the truth before the words came. "We'll do what we can," the man said gently, "but her body is very tired." Edward sat beside Lily in the waiting area, her small hand still gripping his. Hours passed in silence. When the doctor finally returned, his face said everything. "She's resting now," he said softly. "You can see her, but she doesn't have much time." Edward led Lily into the dim hospital room. Her mother was lying peacefully, her eyes open but distant. When she saw them, she smiled weakly. "You both came," she whispered. Lily climbed onto the bed, hugging her carefully. "I got a star at school today," she said through tears. "I wanted to tell you." Her mother brushed her hair back gently. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Then her gaze shifted to Edward. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "You gave her a life I couldn't. Promise me you'll look after her." The words hit him like a knife. He wanted to argue, to tell her she would recover, that this wasn't the end, but the look in her eyes silenced him. It wasn't despair, it was peace. He nodded slowly, his throat too tight to speak. "I promise," he managed to whisper. A faint smile crossed her lips. "Good," she said softly, closing her eyes as Lily held her hand tighter. Moments later, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor slowed and then faded into a long, hollow silence. Lily buried her face in her mother's chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Edward stood there frozen, feeling an emptiness spread through his chest like ice. He stayed at the hospital long after the nurses had taken Lily's mother away. Lily had fallen asleep in his arms, her face stained with tears. For the first time in his adult life, Edward cried. Not the silent, restrained kind of tears he allowed himself in rare moments of exhaustion, but deep, shaking sobs that came from a place he didn't know existed anymore. He cried for Lily, for her mother, and maybe even for himself, for the years he had wasted chasing things that never mattered. When he finally looked down at the sleeping girl, he realized that she was all he had now. And, in some inexplicable way, he was all she had too. The next morning, when she woke up in the hospital chair, she didn't say a word. She just looked at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "She's gone, isn't she?" she asked quietly. He nodded. She didn't cry again, not then. Instead, she took his hand and said, "Can I stay with you now?" The simplicity of her question shattered him. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "You can stay with me for as long as you want." She nodded and leaned against his shoulder, whispering, "Mom said you'd take care of me." Edward swallowed hard, squeezing her small hand. "I will, Lily," he said. "I promise you, I will." In the following days, he handled everything, the funeral, the paperwork, the arrangements. He made sure her mother was buried with dignity, in a quiet garden overlooking the city. Lily stood beside him the whole time, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. She didn't cry, she just stared at the grave with an expression of quiet acceptance. When it was over, she looked up at him and asked softly, "Do you think she can see me from heaven?" He knelt beside her. "I think she can," he said gently. "And I think she's proud of you." Lily nodded, her eyes glistening. "Then I'll be good," she said. "I'll make her proud every day." As they walked away from the cemetery hand in hand, Edward felt the weight of his promise settle on his shoulders, but it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. For years, he had lived surrounded by power, money, and people who feared him. But in the quiet steps of a small girl beside him, he found the only thing that had ever truly mattered: love. What he didn't know yet was that this new bond, born from loss and kindness, would not only change his life but challenge the very foundations of the man he thought he was. Spring came with a gentleness that neither Edward nor Lily had expected. The air grew warmer, the sun lingered longer in the evenings, and the garden outside the mansion began to bloom with colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real. Lily loved the garden, she would spend hours there after school, chasing butterflies and talking to the flowers as if they were her friends. Sometimes she would sit by the fountain with her book, her small lips moving silently as she practiced reading aloud. Edward often watched her from the window of his study, his work forgotten, feeling something inside him he could never quite put into words. It wasn't just love or affection, it was a quiet awe, the kind that made him believe in second chances. For years, he had thought his life was measured in profits and deadlines, but now it was measured in moments like these, the sound of her laughter, the way her hair glowed in the sun, the peace that came from knowing she was safe. One Saturday morning, he decided to take her to the city. It was the anniversary of the day they met, though he didn't tell her that. To her, it was just a surprise outing. She wore her favorite yellow dress, and he wore a simple shirt without his usual suit jacket, something she teased him about all morning. "You look weird without a tie," she said, giggling as they walked through the park. "Weird good or weird bad?" he asked. "Weird nice," she replied with a grin, slipping her small hand into his. They bought ice cream and fed ducks by the pond, and for a few hours, it felt as if the world had forgotten to be cruel. When she tired, they sat on a bench, and she leaned her head on his arm. "Edward," she said softly, "do you think Mom can see us right now?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I think she never stopped watching you," he said. "And I think she's happy to see you smile again." Lily smiled faintly and whispered, "Then I'll keep smiling for her." That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Edward found himself walking through the quiet house, his thoughts tangled between the past and the present. He stopped by the piano in the living room, a grand instrument he hadn't touched in years. On impulse, he sat down and pressed a single key. The note lingered in the air, trembling like a fragile memory. He began to play, slowly at first, his fingers awkward from disuse. But as the melody grew, something inside him loosened. It was the same song Lily's mother had loved, the one she used to hum when she cleaned the office late at night. He had heard her sing it once, long ago, before she became another name in the list of people life had taken too soon. As he played, tears welled in his eyes. He didn't fight them this time. When the last note faded, he looked up and saw Lily standing in the doorway, sleepy-eyed but smiling. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "Mom would have loved it." He felt his throat tighten. "She taught me that song," he said quietly. Lily walked closer and placed her hand on his. "Then maybe you can teach it to me too." From that night on, music became their ritual. Every evening, after dinner, they sat by the piano together. She would sing in her soft, imperfect voice while he played, and the sound filled the mansion with warmth. The servant sometimes stopped in the hallway just to listen, smiling quietly at the transformation they witnessed. The man who had once lived behind walls of glass and pride now lived for the simple joy of hearing a little girl sing off-key. People in the company noticed the difference too. Edward began new charity initiatives focused on supporting children in need, especially those without parents. He often said during board meetings, "Talent can be born anywhere. We just need to make sure the world gives it a chance." He never mentioned Lily's name in public, but everyone around him understood that she had become the heart behind everything he did. One day, a journalist came to interview him for a magazine article titled, "The CEO with a Heart." She asked the usual questions about his career and success, but at the end, she leaned forward and said, "People say something changed you a few years ago. Was there a moment that made you see life differently?" Edward thought for a long time before answering. "There was," he said finally. "It wasn't a moment. It was a person. A small one." The journalist smiled. "Your daughter?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Something like that," he said with a quiet smile. "She reminded me that kindness is not weakness. It's what keeps us human." That night, when he came home, Lily ran to him with her school project, a family tree drawn in crayon. At the top were two names, her mother's and his. "I didn't know what to write for my dad," she explained shyly, "so I wrote you instead. Is that okay?" Edward felt his chest tighten as he looked at the drawing. "It's perfect," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. She hugged him tightly and said, "Then we're family now." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. He simply held her, feeling the truth of those words sink deep into his heart. Years later, when Lily was grown, she would look back on those days as the happiest of her life. Edward grew older, his hair turning gray, but his eyes never lost their light. She became a musician, traveling the world, and at every concert, she dedicated her final song to the man who taught her that love could heal even the deepest scars. She called it, "The Promise," the same song he had once played for her in the quiet of the night. And in the front row of her first performance, Edward sat with tears in his eyes, clapping as the crowd rose to their feet. When the curtain fell, she ran off stage straight into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "Did I make you proud?" she asked, her voice trembling. He smiled through his tears. "You always have," he said. "From the first day I met you." As they stood there, surrounded by applause and light, it was clear that the story that began in pain had ended in grace. Because sometimes, the most beautiful families are the ones born not from blood, but from compassion, from a simple act of kindness that grows into something that changes two lives forever. And for Edward and Lily, that kindness had become love, the kind that lasts a lifetime.